The second speaker is Clair Baleshta from Western University in Canada. And her presentation is a feminist view of medical AI harm.
Hi, thank you. Here, I'll just get this shared quickly. Hi. All right, can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can see your slides. Fantastic.
Awesome.
It's your turn now.
So much. Great. All right. So yes, as mentioned, my name is Claire. I'm a second-year PhD student at Western University in Canada. Apologies in advance. Also, there's all of a sudden some construction in my apartment, so I'm very sorry if there's any background noise. But all right, yes, my presentation today focuses on medical AI harm and how we should go about understanding it. So just to start off, I'll provide a bit of a brief overview of my plan for the presentation. I'll first illustrate how, though there exist widespread concerns about the harms of artificial intelligence in contexts like medicine, there's been an absence of explicit analysis regarding what actually constitutes a harm when looking at the impact of these systems. And I argue that this isn't just a sort of nitpicky philosophical concern, but a real and pressing problem, given that such an analysis is necessary for both the accurate identification and the effective reduction of the harms imposed by this technology. Appealing to the philosophy of harm literature, I then try to demonstrate the difficulty of attaining a clear guiding concept of harm. Despite harm playing a central role in moral, legal, and political philosophy, there's still significant disagreement regarding how to define the concept. Part of this presentation will also demonstrate just how unfit the existing philosophy of harm literature is when it comes to understanding AI harm, given the scholarship's focused on idealized views of harm. And then by taking an alternative non-idealizing approach to conceptualizing harm, this presentation aims to develop a distinctive feminist account of medical AI harm, connecting harm to a view rooted in relational theories of well-being. Given the centrality of both harm and well-being concerns in medicine, the account will be particularly valuable for understanding the harms of AI in the medical context. However, my hope is that it will also be applicable to and have implications for our understanding of AI harm more generally. So before getting into all of this, I'll just provide some general background on AI harm in the context of medicine to help motivate the talk. For starters, the increasing prevalence of AI technology, it's come with major expectations regarding the benefits that such systems may offer. In medicine specifically, there is significant enthusiasm regarding the promise of AI. Among other things, it's expected to offer substantial improvements in areas such as clinical diagnosis and treatment, patient safety, and administrative optimization. However, while the use of medical AI will clearly offer significant benefits, its potential to cause serious harm has also been widely recognized. Many of these concerns surround the potential for AI systems to infringe on privacy, contain biases that lead to inaccurate outputs, and leave patients without explanations for diagnoses or treatment decisions. Moreover, there's been significant concern regarding the disproportionate allocation of such harms. When it comes to medical AI, research has shown that these systems can automate and perpetuate unjust and discriminatory patterns in a way that causes serious harm. So, for instance, there are specific concerns surrounding the presence of racial and gender biases in medical AI systems, which can lead to disparities in diagnostic accuracy and deepen existing inequities in health and healthcare. As a result of these concerns, we've also seen increasing efforts directed toward understanding and addressing the harms of AI in medicine and beyond. For instance, research in areas like AI governance have emerged, wherein the role of said governance is ultimately to take practical steps to mitigate this risk of harm. In this domain, there's been a growing number of proposals for medical AI governance frameworks specifically. Similarly, healthcare organizations, along with academics, journalists, private companies, and policymakers across the globe have been trying to map how the development and use of AI can cause harm. And at the same time, regulators are beginning to assess the extent to which existing laws are able to address these harms, or whether new regulatory measures may be needed to secure protection therefrom. So based on all of this, it's clear that harm plays an increasingly salient role regarding AI use in contexts like medicine. Yet despite widespread attention to the harms of medical AI, there's been incredibly little discussion as to what exactly is meant by harm here. And this is also by no means a unique problem for the medical AI literature. It's been argued more generally that despite the importance harm has across a range of domains, almost nobody bothers to say what it is. And this wouldn't be a problem if harm were just a sort of simple, uncontroversial concept, such that relying on intuitive notions alone would suffice. But harm is not such a simple concept, and there are often significant disagreements about what counts as harm. Moreover, relying on intuitive understandings of harm can render analyses themselves susceptible to biases, inconsistencies, and other inaccuracies. And AI researchers in particular should be inclined to resist such reliance given the nature of this technology. So in particular, many features of these systems, which make them so promising, can also render their harm highly unintuitive. For instance, the decision mechanisms employed by many AI systems are intended to detect subtle relationships that humans cannot recognize. In many contexts, this proves to achieve results that can outperform even human experts in terms of accuracy. However, the fact that such computational tools are designed to uncover relationships that defy human intuitions means that their harms may be just as unintuitive. By relying only on intuitive notions of harm when assessing the adverse impacts of medical AI, researchers and policymakers therefore risk making incomplete analyses with regulatory gaps that must be addressed to secure protection against AI's adverse effects. And in doing so, the measures that they propose to address these gaps may similarly prove inadequate. As such, I argue that there exists a pressing need for a clear conceptual notion of harm within the current medical AI ethics literature. So one natural place to turn for such a notion is the philosophical literature on harm. Harm is a central concept in moral, legal, and political philosophy, and in recent years, much attention has been paid to defining harm itself. Despite this, however, there remains significant disagreement as to how harm should be understood. So for instance, many theorists advocate for a comparative understanding of harm, where harm occurs when one is made worse off. More specifically, comparative approaches to harm are typically divided into historical and counterfactual accounts. On historical comparative views, one is harmed if they're made worse off than they previously were. On counterfactual accounts, one's harmed if they're made worse off than they otherwise would have been. Though comparative accounts have a strong intuitive resonance, they are subject to some serious counterexamples. So for instance, imagine a diagnostic system incorrectly diagnoses a patient, which leads to treatment that causes moderate harm. If this system was not used, however, a clinician would have incorrectly prescribed a treatment that led to severe harm. Here, a counterfactual view of harm wouldn't register the AI system as having caused harm because the patient would not be worse off otherwise. Conversely, if a bias that prioritized white patients was removed from the triage algorithm, the account would actually view this as harming white patients because they're technically worse off than they would have been if the bias was retained. So based on these problems, some theorists have questioned why comparisons are salient, and in response, they've developed non-comparative accounts of harm, where one is harmed if they're just made to be in a bad state. This view faces its own set of problems, however. In general, non-comparative accounts fail to recognize harms that do not result in a non-comparatively bad state, while at the same time, they register harms in cases where one goes from a severely bad state to only a moderate one. For instance, imagine I'm in severe pain and a system recommends prescribing a medication that alleviates my pain but leaves me with moderate nausea. Given that having moderate nausea is a bad state to be in, such accounts would view me as being harmed by the system in this case. So as a result of the difficulties with both comparative and non-comparative accounts, some theorists have opted for other alternatives. Cancer, for instance, defends an event-based account of harm rather than a state-based account. And here harm is understood in relation to basic goods. So these are not states or conditions that it's good to be in, but just things that it's good to have. This includes a fairly general set of physical and mental powers or abilities, and one suffers a harm on some level with respect to the loss of these goods. However, the approach is not only misaligned with how we typically think about the lasting nature of harm, but also makes it difficult to account for cumulative harms, which arise when the widespread, repetitive, or cumulative character of a practice renders it harmful. In these cases, each individual instance or event may be negligible when it comes to harm, meaning that event-based accounts will necessarily overlook this. So given that AI systems can and do cause cumulative harms, event-based accounts are clearly insufficient for understanding the adverse impacts of this technology. Moreover, the ways in which both comparative and non-comparative accounts of harm may misidentify AI harm renders them similarly inapplicable. And given that analogous criticisms arise regarding other approaches to harm developed within this scholarship, simply relying on the extant philosophy of harm literature is therefore not a promising solution when it comes to understanding medical AI harm. So the various criticisms associated with standard philosophical accounts of harm may merely imply that more work is needed within this literature to ascertain a proper account for medical AI harm. However, the ongoing difficulty of arriving at a suitable understanding may point to a larger issue, especially when it comes to understanding harms like those of medical AI. In particular, the philosophy of harm scholarship has traditionally relied on what's called ideal theory methodology, wherein accounts begin from simplified or idealized conditions under the assumption that non-ideal complexities can be reintroduced afterward. As a result, much of the literature on harm proceeds by way of thought experiments and toy examples and reveals very little awareness of or concern for the acute real-world harms. Given the messiness of grappling with complex concepts like harm, it's not hard to understand why beginning with an idealized model may seem like a reasonable first step. Yet by ignoring non-ideal conditions, these accounts wind up excluding realities that are crucial to our comprehension of the actual phenomenon itself. So for instance, such accounts typically abstract away from relations of structural domination, exploitation, coercion, and oppression. Given that these relations profoundly shape people's lives and experiences, however, we're left with accounts that are rarely applicable in real-world instances. So based on what we know about medical AI systems and their disproportionate impacts on marginalized groups, this inattention to the effects of injustice, dominance, and oppression found in the philosophical literature on harm clearly has repercussions for analyzing AI's group level or social harms. Less obvious, however, is the impact that it has on individual level harms. And these are the harms that standard accounts tend to focus on exclusively, and they're also the primary type of harm that much of the current AI ethics literature aims to address. Although highly individualistic views of harm that present in the standard accounts tend to obscure the ways in which social and systemic factors are relevant, even at the individual level, attention to these factors is often needed to fulfill widespread requirements for an acceptable theory of harm. So, for instance, within the philosophical literature on harm, it's widely accepted that a suitable theory must be extensionally adequate, meaning it must fit the data in terms of accurately accounting for harms and avoiding over or under identification. However, in order to understand whether or not something truly is a harm, we often need to look at the non-ideal social context. And this is because what constitutes a harm to one individual does not necessarily constitute a harm to another. For example, an AI system used for medical diagnosis, which leaves patients without an explanation for its results, may not constitute a harm to everyone, but for a patient who's experienced discrimination in healthcare, it could reinforce feelings of marginalization or even lead to noncompliance with treatment, causing significant harm. Similarly, harm theorists have repeatedly stressed that an adequate theory of harm needs to enable us to measure the severity of harm. Yet, social and systemic factors also greatly impact the severity of a given individual harm. For example, though privacy breaches may constitute a harm no matter who you are, they can cause patients with certain stigmatized illnesses to be alienated from their communities. They can reduce a person's opportunities for employment. They can even lead to unwarranted increases in health insurance costs. So from these examples, one can see how analyses of non-ideal social and structural factors are often relevant to our understanding of medical AI's disparate impacts, even at the individual level. Moreover, attention to these factors at the individual level has implications for our understanding of wider harms as well. For instance, by ignoring social and systemic factors, ideal theory accounts often explicitly focus only on harms to individuals of normal vulnerability. To provide some examples, Feinberg relies on a normal baseline when developing his account of harm, such that it is the person of normal vulnerability whose interests are to be protected. Thompson similarly explains that harm to those more vulnerable should be allotted less weight. So such a view will clearly lead to underidentification regarding harms to individuals of heightened vulnerability. However, another implication of a focus on normal vulnerability is that standard views often struggle to account for a notion of group harm. Thomas Simon explains how group harm can occur when harm to one member of a group makes other members of the group more susceptible to harm. Or in other words, a group becomes harmed when the harm directed against a member of the group lowers the threshold of vulnerability for other group members. So think, for instance, of feedback loops and AI tools used for predictive policing or recidivism prediction. The problem then is that by focusing only on normal levels of vulnerability, standard accounts of harm necessarily neglect any changes in vulnerability required for the identification of these group level harms. As this is the level at which the disparate impact of medical AI is particularly salient, such accounts would systematically overlook disparities in allocation. So in sum, what might appear to be a reasonable methodology when it comes to analyzing complex concepts like harm turns out to be a highly problematic approach. Though theorists have begun to point out idealized features of existing harm accounts, none have explicitly connected the use of this methodology to the ongoing difficulties of ascertaining a suitable notion of harm. Noting this general flaw within the current scholarship helps to highlight a wider set of prospects for understanding medical AI harm in a non-idealized sense. At the same time, however, it shows us that minor tweaks or changes to existing theories are insufficient. We need a more radical approach to defining harm if we are to attain a notion that's suitable for understanding the adverse impacts of AI in contexts like medicine. So what exactly such an account should look like, however, is an open question. Here I aim to present one option for a theory of harm that medical AI researchers might instead appeal to, one that ties harm to adverse impacts on well-being, where well-being is conceived of relationally. So to motivate this view, first note that well-being is itself an underlying feature in many standard accounts of harm. On comparative accounts, harm occurs when one is made worse off. Non-comparative accounts place emphasis on the concept of being in a bad state, and event-based accounts emphasize the loss of basic goods, the possession of which makes possible the achievement of a reasonably happy life. So all of which connect back to well-being in various senses. In recent work, Johansen and Risberg draw on this insight to argue that standard theories largely do not take serious enough the centrality of well-being to our understanding of harm. More specifically, they argue that deviations from a focus on well-being have led to problematic accounts of harm, and that centering our understanding of harm around negative impacts on well-being provides a legitimate account in its own right. The theorists provide an overview of considerations in support of a well-being view of harm, including its ability to avoid the pitfalls of current accounts and offer a unified view of harms and benefits. So based on their arguments, it appears that a focus on well-being is a promising direction for a theory of medical AI harm. However, Johansen and Risberg do not offer any definition of well-being within their proposal. In order to ensure that a novel theory of medical AI harm addresses relevant non-ideal factors, I aim to provide a more specific view of how well-being should be understood. So although well-being is a central concept in philosophy, it itself is often understood in canonical accounts as highly individualistic and idealized. As feminist theorists have long pointed out, this traditional view is inadequate when it comes to addressing the impact that wider social and systemic factors often have on well-being. Drawing on these criticisms, I argue for adopting a feminist view of well-being when analyzing the harms of medical AI. Importantly, feminist philosophy is typically recognized as a non-idealizing theoretical approach. Works within this scholarship not only examine and theorize actual lives, they focus on the lives of those who live under conditions that are particularly distant from the ideal, a distance that is generated and sustained by systemic sources of injustice. As such, I argue that a feminist approach provides a strong non-ideal theoretical framework for understanding the harm of AI in contexts like medicine. So one major feature of feminist accounts of well-being is their focus on a relational view of the self, which is a picture of the self that involves a recognition of its socially embedded nature. In drawing on relational theory, these approaches focus both on understanding the impacts of personal relationships, as well as the wider social and structural relations of which they are a part. So based on this, I define harm in terms of adverse impacts on well-being, where well-being is understood in a relational sense. Such a definition actually aligns with more general arguments in favor of a relational approach to AI. So for instance, Berhain explains how relational theory stimulates us to consider the broader, contingent, and interconnected background that algorithmic systems emerge from and are deployed to in the process of protecting the welfare of the most vulnerable. So in recognizing the social context in which AI is situated, a relational approach to medical AI harm would be able to account for the disparate impacts of these harms at both the individual and group levels. Moreover, as Sarah Clark Miller notes, when we begin from a relational concept of the self, we generate new conceptions of harm. In particular, a relational account could also allow us to identify a wider set of medical AI harms. For example, it makes possible the recognition of what Miller refers to as relational harms. And these are harms which occur not to individuals or groups, but to relationships and relational capacities themselves. And there's been significant discourse surrounding the adverse impacts of medical AI on these very factors. For instance, the erosion of clinician-patient relationships, clinician self-trust, and the loss of public trust in medicine and medical institutions as a result of AI. So as such, a relational account of medical AI harm would allow for these other impacts to also be rightly viewed as harms. In addition to these identificatory benefits, adopting a relational approach may also help researchers to move away from purely technical solutions to medical AI harm. As Berhain notes, current approaches to addressing the harms of this technology remain narrow in scope. focusing on fine-tuning specific models, making datasets more inclusive or representative, and debiasing datasets. Though such work may definitely be part of the solution, we also need to examine the wider picture, including unquestioned assumptions in datasets, current and historical injustices, and power asymmetries. So by bringing questions about various social and systemic factors into the scope of AI harm analyses, a relational account of harm therefore supports the development of wider socially oriented solutions that go beyond current technical strategies. So just to briefly conclude then, in this presentation, I've aimed to demonstrate the need for a clear conceptual notion of AI harm in order to accurately identify and address the impacts of this technology in contexts like medicine. In doing so, I've also shown why existing harm theories are not qualified for this role. In particular, I've shown how an ideal theory approach to understanding the harms of medical AI is insufficient, and instead advocated for adopting a non-idealizing account that defines harm in terms of adverse impacts on well-being, where well-being is understood in a relational sense. Such a definition is able to more accurately address the real-world harms of AI in areas like medicine, including their disproportionate impacts on members of marginalized groups. As such, I argue this account provides a stronger conceptual foundation on which to identify and remedy the harms of this technology. And then I just have my references, and I can stop sharing.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation on harm, and as it relates to harm in medicine and harm in AI uses in medicine. Thanks a lot. Are there questions, comments, thoughts? Lucas?
Yeah, many thanks. So you've sort of critiqued different models and you've suggested your own, but could you also give an example where, like a concrete example where your own model is superior to those that are around already? Just one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Case, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of a positive and negative aspect of this. Andrew Hansen and Risberg go into more detail about how well-being, like you can experience an adverse impact on well-being even if you're not made worse off than you otherwise were, than you had previously been, or if you don't result in a bad state. And it doesn't have to be a particular event. So they sort of, their paper goes really into detail contrasting or like showing the benefits of these account or a well-being approach over some of these other accounts. And the existing literature basically just goes back and forth in terms of giving counterexamples to each other's views. So there's a way in which sort of it avoids some of the pitfalls of those cases. So for instance, if one of the examples I gave was a medical AI system incorrectly diagnosing someone and leading to treatment that caused moderate harm, whereas but if the system was not used, a clinician would have incorrectly diagnosed them, leading to treatment that caused severe harm. Counterfactual accounts can't understand that as a harm, but a well-being account clearly could. And then there's like a sort of the positive benefit is it incorporates those considerations of wider social and systemic factors that are missing from current harm literature, which then allows you to think about some of these, like, okay, when we're looking at severity, we don't just treat everyone as in an equal social position, and that can help us understand things like, for instance, the harm literature, a really big issue in it right now is their understanding of disability. So they often talk about disability, even like examples like blindness as like a sort of level 1 non-derivative harm and it's like the sort of standard example, whereas there's a whole host of literature showing that like the degree to which someone experiences like a lack of well-being due to their disability is like highly contingent on wider social factors, like the whole social model of disability. And accounts sort of just totally overlook that because they aren't considering any of those social factors. So I think any case where social factors impact people's vulnerability to harm or people's ability to cope with certain things, I think that's where it really helps. So especially when it comes to disparate impacts. Does that answer your question?
I thought at some point when you said AI harms in medicine, that's also the negative views people are getting from, you know, AI applications. And I understood that this would be something that could be explained with your approach in the sense of in the sense of it considers the relations people build up the social context and then can consider those social aspects, if I understood this correctly. I have a question about a statistical harm. I mean, yeah, it's true, harm around AI, it will be in medical context, it will be done to particular specific persons, but overall it may look like statistical harm. Is there a way that your approach can deal with this?
So thinking about harm. Oh, sorry,
Because
continue.
officially it's not like something will be taken away from someone or that will not be a comparison, but it's just statistically that certain groups or certain people, or just statistically the result will be like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I'm going to just quickly comment on your comment because I thought that was really interesting about
Maybe I'm wrong. This is just what I understood.
No, absolutely. This is great. What you were saying about understanding the like sort of perceptive harms and like the concerns surrounding harm, being able to address that too. I think accounting for those relational harms, like harm to relationships and harm to public trust and things like that, the account can explain, but at the same time, it can also address some of the sort of overhype of AI harm. For instance, there's a lot of concern about lack of transparency or lack of explainability when it comes to certain diagnoses. But Alex John London has a really interesting argument that talks about how actually in a lot of medical contexts, we don't get that sort of detailed causal explanation of diagnoses or treatments to begin with. And so I think by distinguishing that, like, sometimes harms aren't going to occur to everyone, it depends on your social position, and sort of these background considerations can also help to mediate or sort of get a more realistic picture of the extent to which some of these harms that are currently like very much emphasized are actually going to play out. And then in terms of your question about statistical harm, I think that's where being able to account for group level or social harms is really important, and standard accounts struggle to do that, whether it is because they just don't, they focus on everyone. Another feature of ideal theory, which appears in the harm literature, is this view of sort of atomistic individual self-sufficient agents, where you don't really see the interconnections or interdependencies or relationships between people which constitute these groups. So in general, they struggle to account for this social level of harm to certain groups, but then specifically, like for instance, the event-based accounts struggle to account for cumulative harms that show up in those statistical analyses, but don't show up at like the individual to individual case. And similarly, the focus on normal levels of vulnerability makes it really hard to understand that interrelated group harm that can occur. So I think that understanding, because you can understand well-being as an individual concept, or you can understand it as a group level concept. We often talk about the well-being of collectives or groups. So I think that transferability and the sort of unified view that that provides might be helpful for that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, so thank you again, Claire, for your great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.